The stagecoach bucked and swayed, a wooden beast chained to the whims of a rutted dirt track. Inside, Ronan Harper braced himself against the cracked leather, his gaze fixed on the endless expanse of rust-colored earth, blurring past the window. He was a man adrift as past a ghost. He was trying to outrun his future. A blank page he hoped to fill in the raw, unforgiving town of Redemption Gulch. He wasn't seeking redemption, merely quiet. The other passengers, a portly salesman mopping his brow, and a prim woman clutching a birdcage, chattered nervously, their voices a thin counterpoint to the rhythmic groan of the axles and the thunder of hooves. Ronan's hand instinctively went to his chest, his fingers closing around the cool, familiar weight of the silver locket beneath his shirt. It was his compass, his anchor, the last tangible piece of a life that had been stolen from him. The stagecoach lurched violently, tossing the passengers like rag dolls. The salesman yelped, and the canary in the cage fluttered in a panic. Outside, a gunshot cracked the air. "Riders!" The driver bellowed, his voice choked with fear. "Hold on!" The coach slewed sideways, the horses screaming as they were reined in. Another shot, closer this time, splintered the wooden frame near Ronan's head. He remained unnervingly still, his body tense, but his mind clear. He had seen violence before. He knew its smell, the acrid tang of gunpowder and fear. The door was ripped open, and the face that appeared was framed by a grimy bandana, eyes cold and predatory. "Out, all of you wallets and valuables on the ground." Ronan moved with the others, his hands raised in a gesture of placid compliance. He stepped onto the sun-baked earth, the heat radiating through the soles of his boots. 5 men, their faces obscured, circled them on horseback rifles held with casual menace. Their leader dismounted, a tall, wiry man who moved with the swagger of a wolf. He strode past the trembling salesman, kicking his dropped sample case into the dust. He ignored the woman who was sobbing over her frantic bird. His eyes landed on Ronan. There was something in Ronan's stillness that drew the man's attention, a lack of fear that was either foolish or dangerous. The leader stopped in front of him, his gaze sweeping over Ronan's plain, travel-worn clothes. Then his eyes snagged on the fine silver chain, visible at Ronan's collar. With a swift, brutal motion, the man yanked the chain. It snapped, and the locket fell into his gloved palm. "Something pretty for a man like you." He sneered, his voice a low gravel. He was Silas Calloway, though Ronan didn't know the name yet. He only knew the cold cruelty in the man's eyes. Silas's thumb found the clasp. He pried the locket open, and then he froze. The sneer on his lips vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. Inside, the miniature, hand-painted portrait of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile stared up at him. Silas's breath hitched. His knuckles went white as he gripped the silver oval. The air grew thick with a new dangerous tension. This was no longer a simple robbery. The other outlaws shifted uneasily, glancing from their leader to the silent stranger. "Where did you get this?" Silas snarled the words torn from his throat. He took a step closer, his face a mask of raw, possessive fury. He thrust the open locket inches from Ronan's face. "Tell me—" Ronan's blood ran cold. The woman in the locket was Elizabeth, his late wife. The question was not just an accusation. It was a violation, a desecration of the one sacred thing he had left. His grief, a quiet, constant companion, ignited into a protective fire. "It was my wife's." Ronan said, his voice low and steady, a stark contrast to Silas's ragged fury. Silas stared at him, his mind reeling. He looked from the portrait to Ronan's face, searching, disbelieving. "Liar," he hissed. He lunged forward, shoving the barrel of his pistol hard against Ronan's chest. "She didn't have a husband. She belonged to us. Before Ronan could answer, one of the other riders called out, "Silas, posse comin', we got a ride." The urgency in his subordinate's voice seemed to break the spell. Silas's eyes, burning with a complex fire of rage and confusion, held Ronan's for one last, searing moment. He didn't return the locket. Instead, his fingers closed around it, a look of twisted triumph on his face. He backed away, swinging into his saddle. This ain't over." Silas spat at Ronan. "When you get to Redemption Gulch, you ask for the Callaways. I'll be waiting." With a final contemptuous glare, he spurred his horse, and the gang vanished into a cloud of red dust, leaving behind a shattered stagecoach and a silence heavy with unanswered questions. The salesman collapsed in a heap, and the woman wept. But Ronan Harper stood motionless, his hand pressed to the empty space on his chest, a cold new purpose beginning to form in the hollow where his heart used to be. The quiet life he had sought was already gone. In its place was a name Calloway, and a promise of a reckoning. Redemption Gulch was less a town and more a wound on the face of the prairie, scabbed over with raw lumber and false fronts. The fine red dust Silas's gang had kicked up seemed to be its primary building material, settling like a blush on every windowsill and coating the tongues of its inhabitants. As Ronan walked down the main street, the groan of the saloon doors, swinging in the heat-shimmered air, sounded like a weary sigh. Men in sweat-stained hats watched him from the shade of wooden awnings, their gazes lingering, assessing. News of the robbery had ridden into town faster than the crippled stagecoach. He was looking for the sheriff's office, but his eyes were drawn to a scene unfolding near the mercantile. A young woman with hair the color of sun-scorched straw was desperately trying to soothe a crying infant cradled in her arms. She was thin, her dress patched and faded, her face etched with a fear so profound it seemed to have carved permanent lines around her eyes. A hulking figure stood over her, his shadow swallowing her whole. It was one of the men from the robbery Ronan recognized instantly, though his face was now bare. "I told you, Mary Beth." The man growled, his voice loud enough for the whole street to hear. "My brother wants to see the brat. Now." The woman, Mary Beth, shrank back. "She's sleeping, Billy. Don't wake her." "Silas ain't a patient man," Billy sneered, reaching for the bundle. Mary Beth clutched the baby tighter, turning her body to shield her. "Please," she whispered, her plea lost in the dusty air. From the doorway of the mercantile, an older, impeccably dressed man emerged. He had the same sharp, predatory features as Silas, but where the son was volatile fire, the father was ice. This was Jedediah Calloway. He surveyed the scene with cold disapproval, his eyes flicking over Mary Beth with a look of utter contempt. "Silas is busy." Jedediah said, his voice crisp and authoritative. "The child stays with its mother. For now, see that she gets back to work." He didn't spare another glance for Mary Beth or the baby, turning his attention to Ronan, who stood watching from across the street. Jedediah's eyes narrowed, a flicker of recognition in their depths. "You're the one from the stagecoach." It wasn't a question. Ronan simply nodded, his gaze unwavering. "And my son is impulsive." Jedediah said, a thin, unconvincing veneer of civility in his tone. "He sometimes acquires things that don't belong to him. If you've come seeking restitution for a stolen trinket, you'll find our family doesn't engage in such petty transactions." "I'm not here for a transaction," Ronan replied, his voice flat. "I'm here for what's mine." Jedediah's lips thinned into a bloodless line. "Redemption Gulch belongs to us, stranger. Everything in it. Remember that." He turned on his heel and strode away, leaving Billy to herd a terrified Mary Beth back toward the sprawling Calloway ranch at the edge of town. Ronan watched them go, the pieces clicking into place. Silas Calloway. Jedediah Calloway. This town wasn't just their home, it was their kingdom built on fear and intimidation. And Mary Beth and her child were their property. He found the sheriff's office, a cramped, dusty room that smelled of stale coffee. Sheriff Miller was an older man, with a weary face and a star that looked too heavy for his chest. He listened to Ronan's account of the robbery with a practiced patience, writing nothing down. Silas Calloway. Miller sighed, leaning back in his chair until it groaned in protest. He's Jedediah's boy. The Calloways pretty much own this valley. They bring business, but they bring trouble too. He stole something from me, Ronan said. A silver locket. The sheriff rubbed his temples. Son, folks around here learn to live with what the Calloways take. A locket. You're lucky that's all it was. My advice, ride on to the next town. Nothing for you here but grief. Grief already found me. Ronan set his voice quiet. He turned and left the office, the sheriff's advice echoing uselessly in his ears. He couldn't leave. Not now. The face in the locket, the wife they claimed was theirs, had bound him to this place. He rented a room at the boarding house and spent the next 2 days in quiet observation, learning the rhythms of the town and the shadow the Calloway name cast over it. He saw Mary Beth only from a distance, scurrying between the ranch and the town on errands, always with her head down, her baby clutched to her chest like a shield. He saw the way townsfolk averted their eyes when she passed, the mixture of pity and fear on their faces. She was a ghost in her own life, trapped in a cage of the Calloways' making. On the third night, Ronan was sitting in the corner of the saloon, nursing a whiskey, when he overheard a conversation that chilled his blood. 2 Calloway ranch hands were talking, their voices low and smug. The old man's finally had enough, one said. Heard him tellin' Silas the girl child is a liability. Said to handle it, and to make sure no one ever knew. The other man chuckled darkly. About time. A bastard girl ain't no use to the Calloway line. Ronan's hand tightened around his glass. Handle it. The words were a death sentence, cold and pragmatic. He looked out the window toward the distant lights of the Calloway ranch and thought of Mary Beth, her eyes wide with a permanent state of terror. He thought of her baby, a life deemed a liability. He had come here seeking a quiet place to grieve, but the world, it seemed, had other plans. Justice for Elizabeth had a face now. It was the face of another woman, trapped in the same web, another mother whose child was threatened by the same cold-blooded evil. Desperation is a powerful forge. In the cold pre-dawn hours, Mary Beth overheard the words that would shatter her world. She was on her knees scrubbing the floor outside Jedediah Calloway's study when she heard his voice through the door, as sharp and cold as a shard of ice. A girl child is a liability, Silas. Jedediah stated not with anger, but with the chilling finality of a businessman closing a ledger. She serves no purpose. She cannot carry the family name, and her existence only reminds everyone of your indiscretion. Handle it. No one needs to know. The blood drained from Mary Beth's face. Handle it. She knew what that meant. She had seen what happened to Calloway liabilities, a ranch hand who spoke out of turn, a prospector who wouldn't sell his claim. They simply disappeared. Her baby, her sweet innocent Sarah, was now just a problem to be erased. Panic seized her, a cold, suffocating wave. But beneath it, a spark of defiance flickered to life. She would not let them put her daughter in the ground. She had run from her own family's cruelty. She would not be consumed by this one's. She needed a way out, a way to escape not just the ranch, but the entire county where the Calloway name was law. An idea born of sheer, mad desperation began to form in her mind. It was a terrible, shameful gamble, but it was the only one she had. If she was property to them, then she would use that to her advantage. She would sell herself to buy her daughter's freedom. That morning, she staged her escape. She told the cook she was taking the baby into town for whorehound drops for a cough. Once clear of the ranch, she ran. She didn't stop until she reached the town center, her lungs burning, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She found a sympathetic woman, the baker's wife, and begged her to watch Sarah for 1 hour, pressing her last silver coin into the woman's hand. Then she walked to the auction platform, the one used for livestock and unclaimed property, and spoke to the auctioneer, a man whose morality was as flexible as his prices. She told him a lie that she was an indentured servant whose contract was being sold. She would give him half the proceeds if he asked no questions. The man's greedy eyes lit up and he agreed. And so she stood on the platform and the rough wood digging into the soles of her bare feet. The murmur of the crowd was a physical force, a wave of judgment and morbid curiosity. "A strong-bodied gal," the auctioneer bellowed, slapping the post beside her. "Good for cooking, cleaning, and taking orders, who will start the bidding for her indenture, $5. Murmurs of pity rippled through the women in the crowd. Cruel jokes were swapped between drunkards leaning against the saloon. A few sharp-eyed ranchers assessed her like they would a mare. "6, someone shouted. 7. Each bid was a nail in the coffin of her dignity, but also a step closer to her daughter's life. The numbers climbed slowly. 8, 9, 10. Her hope began to curdle into despair. No one would bid high enough. No one would take her far enough away. Then a voice cut through the noise, deep and unhurried, carrying weight without force. 100 for her indenture, paid in full. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Silence fell thick and sudden. Every head turned to see the stranger standing apart from the rest, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. It was the man from the stagecoach, the one Jedediah had spoken to. Ronan Harper. Silas Calloway, who had been watching the spectacle from the porch of the Mercantile with a smug grin, felt a jolt of fury. The stranger was interfering again. He strode forward, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "This is Calloway business, stranger." Silas snarled, his voice a low threat. Ronan's gaze met his, and there was no fear in it, only a cold, hard resolve. He didn't raise his voice, but every word was a steel blade. "Looks like it just became my business." The auctioneer, stunned, but smelling a profit he couldn't refuse, slammed his gavel down. "Sold to the stranger for $100. The finality of the sound jolted Mary Beth. A moment later, she was being guided down the steps, her legs unsteady. Ronan waited for her, his expression unreadable. He paid the auctioneer with a roll of bills, his movements economical and precise. Silas watched his face, a thundercloud of rage, but for the moment, in the full view of the town, he did nothing. Ronan turned to Mary Beth. "You got a name?" he asked, his voice softer than she expected. "Mary Beth," she whispered, her throat raw. He gave a single sharp nod. "Come on." He led her away from the gaping crowd, away from the furious glare of Silas Calloway, and out toward the dusty road that led away from town. He hadn't bought a servant. He had just declared war. The path to Ronan's ranch was a lonely track, winding through hills dotted with cedar and sun-bleached rock. The silence in the wagon was a heavy blanket, woven with suspicion and fear. Mary Beth huddled in the corner, clutching the swaddled form of her daughter Sarah, whom they'd retrieved from the wide-eyed baker's wife. Every creak of the wagon wheels sounded like a footstep behind them. She had escaped, but she felt no relief. She had merely traded one cage for another, and she knew nothing of this new jailer. Ronan's ranch was a testament to solitude. A low, sturdy cabin, a weathered barn, and a few split-rail corrals sat in a small valley, looking as though they had grown from the earth itself. It was a place built for one, a fortress against the world. The first few days were a careful dance of distrust. Mary Beth expected orders, demands, the casual cruelty she had known her entire life. Instead, Ronan offered only a quiet, unnerving courtesy. He gave her the cabin's only bed, sleeping himself on a bedroll by the hearth with a rifle propped beside him. He showed her the well, the goat pen, the small vegetable patch, his explanations sparse and practical. He never touched her, and his eyes, when they met hers, were distant, clouded by a grief she couldn't begin to understand. His kindness was more unsettling than cruelty. It felt like a trap. She cooked his meals and cleaned the small cabin with a frantic energy, trying to prove her worth, to pay a debt she didn't comprehend. He would eat in silence, thank her, with a quiet nod, and retreat back into his shell. One evening, as she was washing the dishes, he spoke from the doorway where he was mending a bridle. "You don't have to work yourself to the bone," he said, not looking at her. "I didn't bring you here to be a slave." "Then why?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why did you do it? That was more money than I'm worth in 10 lifetimes. He finally looked at her, and for a moment the veil of grief lifted. She saw something else in his eyes, a flinty resolve, hard and sharp. "The Callaways thought they owned you," he said. "I don't abide by men who think people are property." It was an answer, but not the whole one. She could feel it. The real reason was buried deeper in the same secret place where he kept his sorrow. The external threat, when it came, was just as quiet and unsettling as their life together. A few days after her arrival, Mary Beth saw him, a Callaway ranch hand perched on a ridge overlooking the valley. He wasn't doing anything, just sitting on his horse watching. He was there the next day and the day after that. A silent, constant reminder that they were being observed, that the Callaways had not forgotten. Ronan saw him too. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Instead, his focus shifted. The quiet truce between them began to evolve into something else. He was no longer just a protector. He was becoming a teacher. One afternoon, he came back from the barn and set a heavy rifle on the table. Mary Beth flinched. "You need to learn how to use this," he said calmly. I can't," she stammered. "I've never held a gun." And that's why you were trapped," he replied, his voice firm but not unkind. "Fear keeps you in the cage. This is how you learn to break the lock." He took her out into the valley, away from the watchful eyes on the ridge. He was a patient instructor, his large hands guiding hers, showing her how to hold the rifle, how to brace it against her shoulder, how to breathe before squeezing the trigger. The first time she fired, the recoil knocked her backward, and the noise left her ears ringing. But she hit the tin can he'd set on a fence post. A thrill, sharp and unfamiliar, shot through her. It was the feeling of power. As he taught her to shoot, she taught him to live again. The cabin, once a sterile monument to his loss, began to change. She found a patch of wildflowers and put them in a tin cup on the table. The smell of baking bread began to replace the lingering scent of wood smoke and solitude. The sound of Sarah's gurgling laughter filled the quiet spaces. Ronan would watch them sometimes, a look of profound sadness on his face. But it was a sadness now mingled with something else, something warmer. He began to talk not about his past, but about the ranch, the land, the way to read the sky for rain. Small offerings, pieces of his world. In turn, she told him about Sarah, about her hopes for her daughter to grow up strong and free. They were building a partnership, a fragile thing held together by a shared threat and a dawning respect. The Callaways escalated their war of intimidation. One morning, Ronan went to the well and found the water brackish and oily. Someone had poured coal oil into their only source of fresh water during the night. They spent the next 2 days hauling water from a distant creek, a back-breaking labor that left them exhausted. A week later, they were woken by the thunder of hooves. The Callaways had driven a small herd of cattle through their fences, stampeding them directly through Mary Beth's vegetable garden, destroying weeks of hard work. It was a calculated act of cruelty, designed to starve them out, to make their life impossible. That evening, as they repaired the broken fence under the cold light of the moon, Ronan's silence was heavier than usual. He was unsettled not just by the attacks, but by the memory that haunted him. Silas Calloway holding his wife's locket, his face a mask of furious recognition. The next day, he rode into town. He didn't go to the sheriff. He went to see Doc Miller, not the lawman, but his brother, the town physician. Doc Miller had been in Redemption Gulch for 30 years. He had delivered half the town and buried the other half. He knew all its secrets. Ronan found him in his small office, surrounded by glass bottles and medical texts. He laid a few dollars on the desk. "I'm not here because I'm sick, Doc. I'm here for information." The doctor looked at him over his spectacles. "About the Callaways, I presume. The whole town is talking." "I need to know about a woman." Ronan said, his voice tight. "Elizabeth." The doctor's kindly expression faded. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes sad. "Elizabeth Calloway, Jedediah's daughter. A sweet girl, not like the rest of them. She died about a year ago. A riding accident, they said. Thrown from her horse, broke her neck." Ronan's blood ran cold. Elizabeth Calloway. His wife had never told him her family name. She had only told him she was running from them. "You don't sound like you believe it was an accident." Ronan said, his voice barely a whisper. Doc Miller sighed, taking off his spectacles and polishing them with a cloth. "I was the one who signed the death certificate. Jedediah stood over me the whole time. The bruises on her, they weren't all consistent with a fall. But in this town, you don't question Jedediah Calloway. Not if you want to keep practicing medicine." Ronan stood up the room, tilting around him. The woman in his locket, his gentle, loving Elizabeth, was a Calloway, the sister of the man who now held her memory in his pocket, the daughter of the man trying to destroy him. Silas hadn't just recognized a portrait. He had recognized his own sister. And Ronan, her husband, was the stranger who had taken her away. The stampede, the poisoned well, they weren't just attacks on a man protecting a girl. They were acts of revenge. He rode back to the ranch, in a daze, the doctor's words echoing in his head. The fight for Mary Beth had just become a quest for justice for his murdered wife. The revelation that Elizabeth was a Calloway settled in Ronan's soul like a shard of ice. His grief, once a dull, constant ache, now had a sharp, vengeful edge. He saw her face everywhere in the slant of late afternoon light, across the cabin floor, in the whisper of the wind through the cottonwoods. He had been mourning a tragic accident. Now he was mourning a murder. His quiet demeanor grew harder, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his hand never far from the pistol on his hip. Mary Beth noticed the change. The fragile peace they had built was replaced by a tense, waiting silence. She saw the new fire in his eyes and knew it had to do with his trip to town, but she dared not ask. He became obsessed with the past his own and the one he never knew. He began searching the cabin not for anything specific, but as if trying to conjure an answer from the very wood and stone. He ran his hands over the rough-hewn beams and floorboards Elizabeth had once touched. He had bought this ranch for her, a place where she could finally be safe, a place to start their life far from the family she would only describe as a gilded cage. He had failed her. The cage had reached out and dragged her back. One rain-swept afternoon, while securing a loose floorboard near the hearth, a spot Elizabeth had always favored, his fingers brushed against something that wasn't wood. It was the corner of a small metal box. His heart hammered against his ribs. He worked the board free and pulled out a tin box rusted at the edges. It was her keepsake box, the one she'd told him held silly things from before. He had never opened it. It felt too much like disturbing a grave. Now he pried it open with trembling hands. Inside, nestled amongst some dried flowers and a ribbon, was a letter. It was written in her elegant script, the ink slightly faded. It was addressed to him, but it was not sealed. A letter she wrote, but never sent. With a sense of dread, he began to read. My dearest Ronan, if you are reading this, it means I did not find the courage to tell you the truth myself, or that I am no longer able to. I pray it is the former. My family name is Calloway. I'm sorry I kept this from you, but I was so afraid. You see them as powerful ranchers, but they are so much more. My father, Jedediah, and my brother Silas have built their empire not just on cattle, but on smuggling, extortion, and blood. They control everything that moves through this territory. Gold guns people. They are monsters dressed in fine clothes. I tried to leave. I saw an evil in them. I could no longer ignore a darkness that was beginning to taint me. They discovered my plan to escape, to come to you and start a new honest life. My father told me I knew too much. He said the Calloway name was everything, and that no one, not even his own daughter, would be allowed to tarnish it. Silas, my brother, is worse. He looks at me with a possessive fire that terrifies me. He said I belonged here with them, that you had poisoned my mind. They will not let me go, Ronan. I know it. They are planning something. I hear them whispering when they think I cannot. I fear my riding accident will happen soon. They will make it look convincing. They are meticulous in their evil. Do not seek vengeance if the worst should happen. They are too powerful. Just live. Live the good, quiet life we dreamed of. Know that I loved you more than anything, that you were my only glimpse of light in a world of shadow. Forever yours, Elizabeth. The letter fell from Ronan's nerveless fingers. The world dissolved into a muted roar in his ears. Murder. It wasn't a suspicion anymore. It was a confession from the grave. Jedediah and Silas had killed their own kin to protect their criminal empire. His Elizabeth, his gentle wife, murdered by her own father and brother. He looked across the room at Mary Beth, who was quietly rocking Sarah by the fire. He saw it all with horrifying clarity. Mary Beth wasn't just some runaway girl they wanted back. She, like Elizabeth, was a woman who knew too much, a woman who had seen the Calloways' true nature and had tried to escape their control. Sarah wasn't a liability because she was a girl. She was a liability because her very existence was proof of Silas's recklessness, a loose thread in the tightly woven tapestry of their power. They weren't trying to silence a scandal. They were trying to bury a witness. The fight was no longer about protecting a stranger. It was about avenging his wife. He was not just defending this cabin. He was standing on the ground where Elizabeth had been murdered, fighting the very men who had put her there. The grief that had hollowed him out now filled with a righteous, white-hot fury. He looked at the rifle propped against the wall and then at Mary Beth and her child. He finally understood. He had failed to save Elizabeth. He would not fail them. The discovery of the letter, transformed Ronan. The simmering conflict with the Callaways now boiled over into open war. The night after he read Elizabeth's words, the sky lit up with an orange glow. Ronan burst out of the cabin to see flames licking at the roof of his barn. "Mary Beth, the water barrels," he yelled, grabbing 2 buckets. They worked in a frantic, desperate rhythm, slinging water against the hungry flames. Embers rained down around them, singeing their clothes and hair. Above the roar of the fire, they heard the sound of riders laughing in the distance. This was not just a threat. It was a message. "We can touch you whenever we want. We can burn your world to the ground." They managed to save the barn, but it was a close thing. As they stood in the smoldering dawn, covered in soot and panting from exhaustion, Mary Beth turned to him, her face grim. "They won't stop, will they?" "No." Ronan said, his voice hard as iron. "But neither will we." He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a woman he was protecting, but as a partner. "The rifle I taught you to use. You remember how?" She nodded, her eyes meeting his with a new shared resolve. The fear was still there, but it was now overlaid with a fierce determination. "I remember." Their alliance, born of necessity, was now forged in fire. They became a unit working together to fortify the ranch. They reinforced the cabin doors, boarded up the smaller windows, and set up a watch schedule. During the long nights, they would sit in the quiet darkness, taking turns watching the perimeter. In those shared silences, a deeper bond formed. He told her about Elizabeth, not about her murder, but about her kindness, her dream of a quiet life. And she told him about Sarah's father, a drifter, who had promised her the world and left her with nothing but a child the Callaways claimed as their own property. They were 2 broken people finding a way to piece themselves back together by protecting one another. The Callaways' final assault came with the fury of nature itself. A sandstorm, a monstrous churning wall of red dust, swept across the plains, turning midday into a suffocating twilight. The wind howled like a banshee, ripping at the roof of the cabin and scouring the land with a horizontal blast of grit. Visibility dropped to mere feet. It was the perfect cover for an attack. "They're coming," Ronan said, his voice a low rumble beneath the storm's shriek. He handed Mary Beth a rifle and a box of cartridges. "Stay away from the window. Bar the door behind me." He stepped outside into the maelstrom, pulling his bandana over his face. He could barely see the corrals, but he could feel them. The air was electric with menace. He took up a position behind a water trough, the wind tearing at him, grit stinging his eyes. He didn't have to wait long. Figures emerged from the swirling dust, like demons, their shapes distorted by the storm. Jedediah, Silas, and a dozen of their men, moving in a closing circle around the cabin. The first shot came from the storm, splintering the wood next to Ronan's head. He returned fire, the blast of his rifle muffled by the wind. The world became a chaotic nightmare of shadowy figures, muzzle flashes, and the howl of the wind blending with the crack of gunfire. Inside, Mary Beth huddled on the floor, shielding a terrified Sarah with her own body. The cabin was being peppered with bullet slugs, thudding into the thick log walls. She was terrified, but the memory of Ronan's patient instructions, of the feel of the rifle in her hands, cut through the panic. She crawled to the small reinforced window slit they had made, pushed the rifle through, and took aim. She saw a shape materialize from the dust, a man raising his pistol toward Ronan's back. She held her breath, squeezed the trigger, and the shape crumpled to the ground. A surge of fierce protective power flooded her. She was no longer a victim. She was a defender. The battle raged. Ronan moved with deadly efficiency, using the storm as his ally, appearing and disappearing in the blinding dust. But they were outnumbered. As he took down one man, another broke from the chaos and charged the cabin door, splintering it with a heavy axe. It was Silas. He burst inside his face a demonic mask of grit and rage. "You!" He screamed at Mary Beth, his eyes wild. He saw his sister's defiance in her, another woman who had dared to choose a life away from him. She would still be alive if it weren't for him. He lured her away, seduced her with his promises of peace. He lunged for her, his vendetta no longer about a baby, but about a twisted, possessive love for his dead sister. Mary Beth scrambled back, raising her rifle, but he was too fast. He knocked it from her hands. Just as he reached for her, the back door flew open. Ronan stood there, a specter emerging from the storm, his face a mask of cold fury. "Get away from her, Silas." Outside, the gunshots had dwindled. The remaining Calloway men, their nerve broken by the ferocity of the defense and the disorienting storm, were falling back. But Jedediah Calloway stood his ground near the barn, firing methodically at the cabin. Ronan ignored the threat outside. His focus was entirely on the two men who had murdered his wife. He charged Silas, and they crashed to the floor in a brutal struggle. It ended when Ronan brought the butt of his pistol down hard on Silas's temple. He turned just in time to see Jedediah reloading, preparing to fire a final killing shot through the shattered doorway. Ronan stormed outside, straight into the teeth of the storm. He closed the distance between them, the wind whipping his coat around him. Jedediah raised his pistol, a look of cold hatred in his eyes. "She was my daughter," he rasped over the wind. "She was blood, and you took her. You killed her." Ronan roared the words torn from him. "You murdered your own daughter because she wanted to be free." He had him. Jedediah was in his sights, the man who had ordered Elizabeth's death. Vengeance was a single trigger pull away. He could end it right here and let the storm bury the bodies. But as he looked at the cold, unrepentant man, he saw Elizabeth's kind eyes. She wouldn't have wanted this. She wouldn't have wanted him to become a monster like them. He had to choose between the vengeance he craved and the justice she deserved. He chose justice. Instead of firing, he lunged forward, his fist connecting with Jedediah's jaw in a blow that sent the patriarch crumpling to the ground, unconscious. As if on cue, the wind began to die down. The thick curtain of dust started to thin. And through the dissipating storm, a new group of riders appeared. Sheriff Miller, flanked by a posse of 6 grim-faced deputies. Doc Miller, having heard of the open attack on the barn, had ridden for the county seat and brought back real law. The sheriff took in the scene the downed Calloway men, the smoldering barn, and Ronan standing over the unconscious forms of Jedediah and Silas. He looked at Ronan, then at the cabin where Mary Beth stood in the doorway, her baby in her arms. "It looks like you had some trouble here, Harper." The sheriff said, his voice laced with a newfound respect. Ronan nodded, his body aching, his soul weary but clean. "The trouble's over now." In the quiet aftermath of the storm, the world seemed washed clean. The red dust settled, and a pale sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the valley. Sheriff Miller and his men rounded up the Calloways, and their surviving hands binding their wrists and loading them into a wagon for the long ride to the county jail. Silas, conscious but dazed, shot a look of pure hatred at Ronan. Jedediah remained silent, his cold mask of authority shattered, leaving only the empty face of a defeated tyrant. As the wagon rumbled away, Doc Miller approached Ronan. He placed a hand on his shoulder. "I found her letter, Ronan," he said quietly, producing the folded paper from his coat. When the sheriff was searching Jedediah's office for evidence, it was tucked away in his desk. He kept it. As a trophy, I suppose. He handed it to Ronan. "This, along with my testimony about her accident, will be enough to see them hang." Ronan took the letter, the paper soft and worn in his hand. He nodded his thanks, his throat too tight for words. He and Mary Beth spent the rest of the day cleaning the cabin, tending to their wounds, which were mostly bruises and scrapes, and patching the splintered doors. The physical work was a balm, a way to mend their shattered world with their own two hands. Sarah, safe and sound, slept peacefully in her basket, oblivious to the battle that had been fought for her future. That evening, they sat together on the porch, watching the last streaks of color fade from the sky. The silence was no longer tense or awkward. It was comfortable earned. "He told me why he hated you so much," Mary Beth said softly. "Silas, he said you lured his sister away." She paused, looking at him. "Elizabeth. That was her name, wasn't it?" Ronan nodded, staring out at the horizon. "She was my wife." And for the first time, he told her everything. About meeting Elizabeth in a town far from here, about her fear of a family she wouldn't name, about their dream of this very ranch. He told her about the locket and the murder and the letter. He laid his whole broken heart bare. She listened without interrupting her expression, full of a deep, quiet empathy. When he was finished, she reached out and placed her hand over his. "She would be proud of you, Ronan," she whispered. "You didn't just get justice for her. You saved us too." Months passed. The prairie turned from the green of spring to the gold of late summer. Life on the ranch found a new rhythm, one of peace and healing. News came from the county seat that Jedediah and Silas Calloway had been tried and convicted of murder and a long list of other crimes. Their reign over Redemption Gulch was over. One cool autumn evening, Ronan stood before the stone hearth. He took the silver locket from his pocket. The sheriff had returned it to him, and opened it one last time, gazing at Elizabeth's smiling face. He had carried her memory like a burden, a heavy stone of grief and guilt. Now it felt different. It felt like a blessing. He had honored her. He had found justice in her name. With a gentle reverence, he placed the locket inside a small carved wooden box he had made and set it on the center of the mantelpiece. It was not a goodbye, but a way of giving her a place of honor, a permanent home. Next to it, he placed another one of his carvings, a small, smooth wooden bird he had made for Sarah, who was now beginning to crawl. He stepped back, looking at the two objects side by side, one representing the past he had honored, the other, the future he was building. Mary Beth came to stand beside him, Sarah balanced on her hip. She followed his gaze and smiled, a real radiant smile that reached her eyes. "It looks right," she said. He slipped his arm around her, and she leaned against him, the three of them, a small, unlikely family silhouetted in the warm firelight. Later, they sat on the porch swing, watching the stars prick the vast, dark canvas of the sky. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, but for the first time in a long time, Ronan Harper felt nothing but warmth. He had come to this place seeking a quiet end to his story. Instead, he had found a new beginning.